And it's funny because she says, your dad is a train wreck from like dandruff to foot fungus. Like he has everything going on with him. Like he's a mess, but we can fix this. We can do some things to help him feel better and continue moving forward with his life. And so I was optimistic about the whole thing, because at that point I knew a lot, but I didn't know enough about bringing my dad to that place where he could actually accept what he was gonna hear.
Yeah.
So when we sat to talk with the doctor, and she told him, you're going to be on dialysis now, and we're going to work with you. We're going to put you on a 4th shift so you can continue working, and you're not going to have to interfere, which was a little misleading at the time. We didn't realize it until later. My dad was legally blind, so he had a lot of limitations, but his question was I'd never seen my dad in this place where his question that he asked her was, how do I reverse this? And that hit me in the face really, really hard, because I looked at him and I said, Dad, it's done. There's no reversing this now.
You're listening to Musings with Morales, brought to you by Dialysis Education Services.
Thanks, everybody, for joining us again. Musings with Morales. I'm Morales. I want to welcome a couple good friends, longtime colleagues, and even people who are mentoring me today, and I've had the opportunity to maybe give a little bit of advice to in the past. First, I want to start to my left, Mr. Richard Cabrera. Richard is an expert in the post-acute care operations, hemodialysis, home hemodialysis, I think even today, and working in the peritoneal dialysis end of things. And with that expertise, you can kind of guess that today's focus would be the home application of dialysis therapies, renal replacement therapies, maybe healthcare as a whole, and maybe some of the challenges that we see in that sort of delivery. To the right, we have Lopez. She is a concierge home dialysis business owner with a lot of experience in the space. That I'll let her tell her story as far as how she got to that point of owning and operating a concierge home dialysis business. But these are two really incredible people I consider friends. I think we have a lot of common whys to, how we got to this place. So thank you both for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you for having us today.
Thanks again, both of you. So let's dive right into it. Again, I think we have common characteristics to how we got to be professionals in the dialysis space or the healthcare space. I'd like to start with you, Luz. If you wouldn't mind, share with us, you're a business owner today. Mm-hmm. What did it look like, the last 5, 10, 15 years? How did you get to this point? What were the pivotal moments in that journey? In other words, that changed your direction or maybe set the direction for you?
For my career?
Yeah.
Okay, so again, my name is Luz, and my journey started about, 14 years ago?
You just look at your watch.
Yeah. 14 years ago, 2010, I actually was diagnosed as end-stage renal disease in 2009. My family and I didn't believe in dialysis, so I refused to have dialysis for almost a whole year.
Wow.
I waited till basically the end. I had to be rushed to the ER with my mother. As soon as I got there, emergency catheter placed on my neck. And that's how my journey started. My family and I, we all thought I was going to die within maybe 2 or 3 years.
Oh, my goodness.
Which it really didn't happen. Dialysis, something that I really want to put out there that is very important for me is dialysis is not the end of life. It's actually a continuation for you to enjoy and keep living rather than surviving. Sometimes we're healthy and we're just surviving. So I started dialysis. I started in clinic. Of course, fear, everything comes in as a patient. You don't know anything about dialysis. You really think you're dying. You see patients getting sick all the time, so you think you're gonna be the next one. I saw, unfortunately, 2 people dying in front of my eyes, and that was very hurtful. But at the same time, it was an option for me to either just sit down and wait for death to come, or take action and continue life. To actually take my health in my hands, and I was very, very. People say lucky, but no, I really consider myself blessed to have had a very amazing team that really helped me. This includes doctors, dietitians, nurses, technicians.
So you initially were doing dialysis in a dialysis center?
Yes.
Okay.
My first 5 years of my journey in dialysis were as a patient in clinic.
5 years.
5 years, yes.
Wow.
I remember when I transitioned from one clinic to another, I saw this patient starting to self-cannulate. The technician at that time was teaching him how to cannulate himself. I'm like, I'm never going to do that. I'm never going to do that. I'm not crazy enough. But unfortunately, I had a hard access for many. So it was hard to cannulate. And
So what does that mean, Luz? Like, I mean, we have a kind of a broad audience base. There are people who wouldn't really know what cannulation is, and why is that such a big deal in taking control of your care, as you said?
Well, first of all, it was like very hurtful. Needles they're not regular gauge needles that we see always in the hospital for blood draw. They're 15 gauge needles, 16, 17 to start. And a lot of the techs would not be able to access my fistula. You could feel it all the way like at the top, but it wasn't. It was very deep instead of you going on a 45-degree angle.
So in other words, there was a patient putting their own needles in their fistula? Okay, got it. So cannulation is when the needles
you put
go
the
in.
needle inside your access. In this
yeah.
case, AV fistula for me.
Yeah.
Which is there's AV graft too. And yeah, so. But again, I had a difficult access. Was not easy to access. My blood flow rate was not good. They would do it at 300. And I've always been like, a heavy side. And I already knew the importance of me not having dialysis. Because as I repeat again, I was about to die before starting dialysis. So I really knew the consequences of me not having dialysis. So one day, my technician that was the best at that, like for me, it's the best. He was not there. And I had to have someone else. And they didn't get it. They hurt my arm. And again, there was 2 times where I was unable to move my arm for about 5 days. I've always been very active, meaning that I did dialysis and work at the same time. So that was a big thing for me, for my daily life. So I was like, nope, this is not happening again to me. I'm going to learn how to do the needles myself. And yes, that's how I started cannulating, putting the needles in my access, that's how my journey started off on my self-care. After probably 2 years of that event, I heard of home hemodialysis. And I read all the advantages of it, which was having more energy. Your labs were better. You could actually do it in a shorter period of time. Of course, more days, but that's actually something very amazing for me. And I was like, I'm interested because as I said, I've always been very active, and it was really hard to adjust my lifestyle to dialysis. So I spoke at that time to the person that was in charge of the clinic, and hey, like I'm interested. So he said, okay, let's go. Let me do it. Fast forward, I got trained in a very short period of time to go home.
And you had already been self-cannulating 2 years.
Yes.
Okay.
And then I moved home. My care partner was my mother, which I'm very grateful for that. She's been in this journey with me. So I started there. From being what we call a non-compliant patient, that I used to cut my time many times because I used to run 4 hours.
Okay. Higher side.
Yeah. And then drink 4 to 5 liters in between treatments. Yes, that's a lot.
Yeah.
So I went home and I started again taking care of myself. And at first I was like, no, this is too much for me. But I'm like, hang in there a little bit longer. Wait. 3 months passed. From 6 days that I was doing, they decreased it to 5 days. And I started having more energy. My labs became better. Phosphorus, which I'm a Mexican and I love cheese, I love beans, I love tortillas. My phosphorus went down. My labs became like in a regular basis, very good. At some point, from being a non-compliant patient in clinic, I became the number one. Oh, that's what I was told in HHD.
You're a number one performer.
Yes. Yes. And so I did home hemo for about 4 years. Everybody told me like, oh no, I mean, there is a high chance, like there is probably a chance that you don't get your transplant because, again, the way you look or the way your body is. But I'm like, okay, it's okay. I'm going to keep trying. I heard my doctor, who's still my doctor, push me a lot to like, hey, keep asking for it. Keep going. And I'm like, okay, let's do it. Like I made an appointment for an evaluation. This was back in 2018. I had never been evaluated. This was the first time. And I got my evaluation at that time. There was a lot of good feedback and a lot of bad feedback. And I'm like, okay, I'm gonna keep doing my thing. February, they call me, hey, we need this other test. We'll see where we go to. And finally, in May of 2019, I get the call that I was added to the list. After 9 years of being in dialysis, I'm like, okay, yay. June, I get clear in insurance the first week of June, and the third week of June 2019, I get my transplant.
Wow.
And
the timing was like lined up just to like, let's get, it's like hike the football. Right?
Well, you know what? I was just happening to think this a couple of days ago. I was at the bank and I'm like, how much I've grown. And something that I always say and why I'm grateful for dialysis overall and I'm very specific about my life and my journey is that I found purpose within my illness. And that's something I try to bring all the time to my patients. Because, again, I just had a talk with a potential patient this past week where I do understand what they're going through. Yeah. And that's what I try to bring to the table. Because we as patients, and not only as patients, but as family of patients, we are in fear because we don't know what's going on. Majority of the patients, they try to continue life and be the same person that they were before the illness, and they can't. They're drained. They're fighting a battle unconsciously. Their body is fighting a battle. Yeah. And they don't know. Their family don't know. And it's hard to understand it. And so I'm very grateful again for the journey, pre, post, during.
I think let's pause there. So you mentioned finding purpose, and ultimately, I think I'd like to kind of hit home with that first before we dive into like expertise, because like I said, you're a concierge home dialysis business owner today. And I think you've spoke to that. Like it's like what's the secret sauce there? I can see it already building up here, right? Richard, let's move over to you, because I think, again, there's a lot of connectivity between the three of us and why we're sitting here today. Maybe kind of the same buildup of like, how did this become your purpose? Because I know it is. I know you well.
Yeah, and it's funny because, you always start out on a different path than the person next to you, right? Yeah. But somehow in this industry, we've always end up, it seems like the people like I'm closest to, we all end up aligning in the same place. Yeah. So for me, it was a little different, in terms of, I came to dialysis just by chance initially. I was a college dropout because I ran out of money, couldn't pay for school anymore. was on a completely different path. I was trying to go down the road of criminal justice and wanted to work with probation, juvenile probation, things like that.
Okay.
But all of a sudden the money ran out. And, when you're at a young age and you're thinking about taking out loans to go to school, it got really scary. It was like, I'm barely making ends meet right now.
Yeah.
How in the world am I going to take out these huge loans to continue going to school? So I said, no, maybe I just need to go work for a little while. So I was working. I had 3 part-time jobs. Imagine that. Like I was a janitor in a SNF, on weekends. I used to take registration for these classes that people would have to do when they got trouble, like with DUIs and things like that.
Okay.
And then I was also working fast food. So, all of that kind of just trying to find my way. I happened to be living with 4 other friends of mine, 4 guys, and we had a house with a 5-bedroom house. And it never failed. Like that 5th person always kind of rotated in and out. Like we had different people all the time, right? Well, one of these times, one of the guys that rotated in was a dialysis technician.
Okay.
And he was hearing me complain one day about having to work all 3 of these jobs, right? And he came to me and he said, I can get you a job tomorrow. And I said, really? And he's like, yeah, full time. I said, what is it going to be? What do I have to do? And he's like, well, are you afraid of blood? I'm like, no, I'm not afraid of blood. He's like, okay, well then let me make a phone call. And it was funny because it was an independent doctor-owned nephrology center / dialysis clinic. And I went in and I met the person responsible for hiring, and she looked at me and she said, when can you start? I had no idea what the job was. I didn't know anything yet. I just said, I can start in 2 weeks.
What year was this?
This was in 1996.
Okay.
So in 96, I said, okay, what's the job? And she said, see that room over there and that big sink? You're going to be our reuse technician. Yeah. And she's like, you're going to be responsible for taking those filters and putting them on the sink, flushing them with water, and then processing them so that they can be used again the next time these patients come in. And I thought, no big deal. I can do that. That seems like, kind of like a glorified dishwasher at that point. I was like, this is not going to be a big deal. So fast forward several years, I create, my little niche there. I learned how to do that. I took to it like a duck to water. I was always interested in learning, and at the same time, I was also very competitive. So there was always like a drive in me to be the best at everything. Right. So in a short period of time, I eventually became a reuse preceptor. I learned water treatment systems at the same time. I learned how to do disinfection of RO and stuff like that. And eventually, our clinic manager said, we want you to become a dialysis technician. So I went down that road. I got trained on site. It's on-the-job training, You get trained as a dialysis technician. I followed a bunch of different mentors in the building that I kind of clung to, and I learned all the little good things and all of this from each of them. And then within a year of being a technician, they made me the preceptor for the clinic. Then eventually that led to being a preceptor for 5 clinics.
For the clinical end.
Yeah, for doing training on the floor, right?
Gotcha.
So now all of a sudden, I surpassed like guys that had been there 7, 8, 9, almost 10 years. Yeah. Here I am after 1 year. I've accelerated myself to be, their lead technician and the guy that was responsible for everything. Like when I say everything, I mean everything. I was doing inventory. I was doing water treatment. I was responsible for training the new staff that came in, whether they were nurses or technicians. I was the one that they had to precept with in order to be able to work on the floor independently eventually. I was responsible for supporting them with schedules and figuring out how to time everything for patients coming in and out. I did a lot of different things in that role, and I always appreciated that role because it really kind of set me up for what I would eventually begin to do down the road. But I also learned a lot about the patients that we work with. I got to see a lot of different patient types, not just, like the standard, crash into dialysis patient, but I got stories from patients that had a wide range of experience, some that had been on dialysis since they were kids, or some that had, didn't even know they were sick, and then others that, knew they were going to eventually end up on dialysis, and some that came from peritoneal dialysis, eventually having to transition to hemodialysis. So I learned a lot early on. But as things happen and, you get comfortable in a position, for me, it was like eventually the job became like almost like assembly line work, which I'm almost embarrassed to admit. But it's important to share that part of my story because there's probably a lot of people out there who do this today that feel the same way, right? I mean, you've probably seen them in your experience, right? They're out there where they just come to work. They don't show emotion. They don't show, joy or any kind of emotion at all. It's
head
just
down, right?
head down,
Yeah.
get the job done, go home, punch in, punch out kind of thing. Get the job done and go home. And for me, it was almost a defense mechanism because I had early on, had developed relationships with patients and got close to them only to watch what was inevitable.
Right.
And that became, something like in the early days, I remember making friends with a guy who had, he was a double amputee. And I remember taking him to a Dodger game with me and my wife and my son and his son. And we drive, because he used to complain, I can't go to games, I can't do stuff because I can't drive.
Yeah.
And so we'd say, let's go. I'll drive. You can get your tickets and we'll just go together. And only to watch him, have an incident, end up in the hospital, and then never come back. And so that became a defense mechanism for me was I'm just going to shut down, do my job, go home, and move on.
How long have we known each other, Richard?
Gosh, what, about almost like 15, 20 years, something like that.
So I know that you've never been assembly line since I met you.
Right.
So, from where's that pivot?
Yeah, so that pivot
what exactly happened.
And that's what something changed, right? In 2005, my dad called me up one day, and he said, "Hey, I'm supposed to go have surgery on my eyes on Monday," and he goes, "I went to do my blood work on Friday, and they keep calling me back from the lab and having me come back and redraw labs."
Yeah.
And in my mind, I'm only dialysis trained at this point, so I don't know anything else. And I told him the only thing I've ever heard that happen is when patients start to have renal failure, they're calling you in because your lab, something is abnormal in your labs, and they're wanting to make sure that you're not needing to go to the emergency room. I said, so let's just wait. Let's not jump to conclusions. Let's wait and see what happens, right? So Monday, sure enough, he meets with his doctor. They canceled his surgery, and they told him, you need to go have a catheter placed, and you're going to end up on dialysis. And
What, Tuesday or Monday?
it was like that next day. So that very day, I contacted my nephrologist that I worked with, and I asked her if she would take my dad on as a patient, and she agreed. Immediately scheduled him to come into the office, and she did a head to toe. And it was so funny because, at the time, I knew my dad was a terrible diabetic for many years. We knew that eventually this was coming, and I'd been warning him for years that this is going to happen. And, he had that chip on his shoulder, like, I'm going to live forever. Nothing's ever going to happen to me. And then all of a sudden, bang, here it is. It's on your doorstep, know?
Yeah.
So she sees him, and she calls me off the floor because her office was attached to our building. She calls me off the floor, wants me in the room with him. And it's funny because she says, your dad is a train wreck from like dandruff to foot fungus. Like he has everything going on with him. Like he's a mess, but we can fix this. We can do some things to help him feel better and continue moving forward with his life. And so I was optimistic about the whole thing because at that point I knew a lot, but I didn't know enough about bringing my dad to that place where he could actually accept what he was going to hear.
Yeah.
So when we sat to talk with the doctor, and she told him, you're going to be on dialysis now, and we're going to work with you. We're going to put you on a 4th shift so you can continue working, and you're not going to have to interfere, which was a little misleading at the time. We didn't realize it until later. My dad was legally blind, so he had a lot of limitations. But his question was like, I'd never seen my dad like in this place where like his question that he asked her was, how do I reverse this? And that hit me in the face really, really hard because I looked at him and I said, Dad, it's done. There's no reversing this now.
So had we been talking about this for years? You mentioned kind of the approach to diabetes that he had. Is that something that
he
understood was leading into?
Yeah. I don't think he did. I don't think he ever let it in. It never sunk in with him.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of, culturally, here's that like that machismo that we talk about all the time.
Yep.
He didn't want to hear that he was vulnerable to anything. And in his eyes, he was in a band. He was somebody in a community that people looked up to because everybody knew him. He used to run youth organizations, youth sports organizations and stuff. So everybody knew my dad. He didn't see himself as vulnerable until that moment. And it was one of those moments, you never get to, like a lot of us don't get to see your dad cry or your dad afraid,
Yeah.
and that was one of those moments where it's like he was afraid.
Yeah.
and I could see it in his face. It was the first time I had ever seen that, because my dad he was not a guy who feared anything. Like he just didn't. And so it changed the way I looked at things. All of a sudden, that changed me, because when I walked out of that office and I walked back out onto the floor, all of a sudden, all of those faces, everybody in there became somebody's mom, dad, aunt, uncle, brother, sister, grandma, grandpa. And even like the way I thought about it is everyone in here is somebody's somebody. Yeah. That stuck in my head from that point on. And I said, I have to change the way I do my job, because these people are all somebody else's people, and I need to make sure that I'm doing the job better than ever. And that competitiveness came out of me again, because now it's like, I want my patients to be the best cared for patients out there. And so we started down that road, and eventually my dad just kind of realized in-center didn't work for him, kind of like you. It didn't take as long. It took only like 6 months because of his routine. So,
he didn't want to be interrupted, or?
Well, it was just the fact that he couldn't drive himself because he was blind.
Oh, yeah.
So, he could see, but he was legally blind. So what would his day look like? He used to get picked up at home by a friend who lived nearby. They would drive to a van pool, and they lived in, like where I live now, in the city of Beaumont, which is, here in Southern California, but it was about a 15-minute drive to the van pool. Then they would take a van pool to the train station, and then the train station they would take to here. He used to work in Anaheim, not too far from here.
Okay.
And then he would have to take a shuttle, because there was no Uber or Lyft or anything like that back then. He would take a shuttle from the train station to the office where he worked at the State Building. Crazy. And then to come home for dialysis, he had to change that, because he used to do everything in reverse to come home before dialysis, but now he had to leave early. So there was no shuttle running at 3:00 in the afternoon when he had to go back to the train station to come home. And then there was no van pool or carpool buddy. So my mom would then have to drive to the train station to pick him up, which was a trek for her, because she was dealing with her own medical issues. My mom had lupus. She was on, she had arthritis. She was on oxygen 24/7. So she was now having to get her little concentrator, jump in her car, drive to the train station, pick him up, and then fight rush hour traffic to get him to dialysis by 6:00, so that they wouldn't cut his time, and that he could get all his full treatment in, and then so that he could go to work the next day. Yeah. And of course, you know how that goes. Like, you get to the center and you're dealing with all of that. You sit down, all of a sudden, all that anxiety sets in, and he started having chest pain. And so immediately complain of chest pain. What happens in dialysis when you complain of chest pain?
Yeah, they send you
to the hospital, right? They take you off and call 911, send you to the hospital. He gets there, they give him an Ativan, and all of a sudden he's fine. Yeah,
angst.
Yeah. And then he's fine. And then, okay, but now how do I get my treatment?
Right.
Because he can't go back. And the only way he can do it is to skip work and go to the next day. And if that wasn't an option for him, he just skipped his treatment.
Oh, gosh.
So needless to say, that didn't work out for him very well. And when we finally hit our rope's end with that, and I went back to his nephrologist and said, this isn't working. She said, and he wasn't a very good PD candidate because he was overweight and because he was diabetic, and, they didn't have all the solutions that they have now. It wasn't a good idea for him to do PD, and he wasn't a fan of having a catheter hanging out of his stomach anyway. So she said, there's this new therapy that we think he could do well on home hemodialysis. And so we said, okay, let's do it. And, that started my journey where, you and I connected not too long after that. And here we go, this is where I've spent the rest of my career.
Before we dive into kind of some expertise, I heard from both of you some commonalities of like the burden of care, the connectivity of your network, people who love you, right? Or you love. Can you speak to that a little bit, Luz, on, the burden of care on an individual? And I want to maybe kind of even rephrase that, because when we talk about taking control of your care, taking control of your own health, your own future, right? The burden of care or the investment in care, what does that look like for an individual? When you started out, you mentioned that there was kind of some
bumps on the road.
Yeah. And with that, like what flips it? You mentioned kind of seeing things, but there's also that point where you mentioned that you did refuse dialysis.
Yes.
So kind of, sorry, I jumbled it up a little
no,
bit.
no, it's
Muddied
okay.
it up, but yeah, could you speak to that a little bit?
I really think that I'm listening to him, and he's saying how many technicians, nurses, staff in general, we adapt a coping mechanism of sometimes not show emotions and do more like an assembly line work rather than caring. I still do clinic. In clinic, it's very rewarding because you get to see and meet a lot of great people. If you ask me, I have this thing that I don't know if it's a blessing or an issue, that I still see things as a patient, and more than a technician. So I get to see what their vulnerable sides are versus their strengths, and it's really hard sometimes to give so much of what they can get. Like as a technician, I can tell you that it's hard sometimes to take care of 9-10 patients at a time versus in home you do. I always say that home hemodialysis adjusts to your lifestyle instead of you adjusting your lifestyle, just like your dad did at the beginning, to dialysis. That's a huge plus. For me, it was harder to adjust from dialysis to transplant than from being really sick to dialysis. Because home hemodialysis helped me recover my lifestyle. You know, like all of that your dad, like you were saying, like, how did he do that? Like, all that traveling from home just to get to dialysis center.
Yeah.
And there's very few people that really understand the impact of a full 3 hours, 4-hour treatment does to your body. So,
or what it does to the family members who are helping you trying to get there,
yes,
right?
And it's like, as a family member, I saw it from my mom. What can you do? Just stay there and watch. There's not much that you can do. But in center, definitely you have patients, many patients are blessed to have people that really care. And that's really hard to find.
Yeah.
And when I see that, like I was listening to you, and it makes a huge impact when you see your patient as someone that can be your loved one.
Yeah.
Rather than just your job.
Right.
Yeah.
And but also, like, I think something that we can do as techs, nurses, staff in general, is that give them the power for it. For me, that's home hemodialysis. Have the power to take care of yourself. Have the power of your life rather than give your power to someone else. Unfortunately, like, it's not that they don't care, because I do see people caring, but we're limited in clinic. We're limited.
Prior to kidney failure, you didn't need a dialysis tech, right? And what I'm hearing from you is like 5 years of your life in center, maybe another 2 with still kind of self-cannulating, that you still had that need. So it was when you hit home dialysis that there was some rehabilitation, there was some kind of the uptick on your whole physical.
And not only that, but you
progress.
really understand everything that your technicians are telling you. Stop drinking water.
Right.
Watch your diet.
The why, right?
You understand the why. You understand because now like, even till now, I know when my body's not at the best, because I got that sensibility, like, in my body to know when I'm not doing at my best, like the right way to function.
Yep.
You understand that. You understand the first and only time that I got high potassium, I was having palpitations. My hands were feeling numb. I didn't know what was going on. They did blood work. My potassium was at 9 something. And I was like, okay, never again.
Yep.
And to this day, like everything that causes high potassium, like, I avoid it.
Luz, what year did you start doing home hemodialysis? And what year did you get your transplant?
I started home hemodialysis in 2015.
Wow.
And I got my transplant June 2019.
Excellent. Richard, let's go to the burden of care with you as well, because kind of different lens. You pointed out just the family member, the network around.
Yeah.
that's Papa, right? As well, right? So
Yeah.
all of that. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, no, I mean, so like to pick up kind of where we left off is like my dad, we heard about home hemodialysis, and, we knew it was going to be limited involvement from my dad right out of the gate because, again, he couldn't see very good, and of course my mom, she had a perspective that was different than a lot of people because a lot of times I think, having worked in home hemo and with home programs for such a long time, you hear a common pushback is like, oh, well, this is going to be too much for my family.
All right.
But people don't realize how much, even on the in-center side, how much burden of like care and just stress that goes to the family. Because you got to think about it. If you're like, for my dad, he was blind. How was he going to get to dialysis anyway?
Yep.
It was on my mom.
Yep.
And then even when she wasn't the one transporting him, she was sitting there hoping nothing was going to go wrong while he was being transported by people that were not really related or connected in other ways except that his friends. So the burden on my mom was, it took its toll. I mean, and so over the years of that, it wasn't even a full year. It was like maybe 6 to 8 months that my dad was in center, became a huge burden on my mom. So when it came time to talk about home hemodialysis and my dad needing a partner, my mom like raised her hand and jumped to the front of the line because she's like, I'd rather have him at home where I can be at home in the comfort of my home, taking care of him there, than to have to do what I'm doing right now.
Yeah.
So it was an obvious choice for her. And my dad was just like, well, if everybody's willing to help me, then I'm open to whatever. I just don't want to feel the way I feel anymore.
Yeah.
And so then I, of course, jumped in also. They kind of pulled me in whether I wanted it or not, because they were like, with your background, you're going to make this so much easier. And I think that's where the obligation came for me, was like, it was a daily conversation with my mom to make sure things were going smooth. I mean, because I had already learned so many different types of machines in my career at that point. Like, this was just another machine. And by the way, it's probably like it's going to be the easiest machine you learn because it's designed for use at home. So it was meant to be that way. So I was like, this is going to take no time at all. I could learn the machine easily. I already know everything else. This is plug and play for me.
Yeah.
The big concern was, can my mom do it? Because again, like I said, she had her own issues. She had lupus, she had arthritis, she didn't have very good hands. So, I mean, my poor dad, he had to go through cannulation with my mom for years, where it was like probably painful for him because she would struggle to get the needles in and just even hand strength to be able to like go in quickly. Like we have that whole thing, like we like, go in quickly, don't hesitate, just go right in.
So did mom take on the blunt of the investment or burden here?
100%. Like she really stepped up and took on everything. She set up his machine to the point where she said it was her treatment. Like she owned it, right? It was her, because the reality was, the most thing that my dad ever did was he picked his movie that he wanted to watch when he sat down, and he picked his snacks up and went and sat down in his chair, and then it was like, okay, here I am, ready. So yeah.
Did she ever tell you like, you don't know how to do that, let me take over?
Yeah, she would always say, no, this is like, she said, like, I have a way of doing things. And it was so funny. And I didn't argue with her in that, because I know, like, growing up with my mom, I knew there was always a chance that we would butt heads over stuff like this, because I'm the trainer and you're the novice, and at the same time,
you don't know how to do that.
She was the expert though when it came to my dad.
Yes.
Because I didn't take care of my dad every day like she did. So I had to respect that. It was a challenge for me. But at the same time, it was great to see, because I learned, I always say this to everybody, especially because, right away when my dad started home hemodialysis, the nurses pulled me into the home program. So I was working both sides. I was the opener for the in-center unit, and then at 8 a.m, I jumped over to work in the home program after my dad got trained, because their thing was, we're peritoneal dialysis nurses. We don't do cannulation on fistulas. So we need somebody over here. And I was the expert in our clinic on cannulation.
Again, what year?
This was in 2006 now.
So 2006, we're 2024. You both have this very high opinion and rehabilitating experience with home hemodialysis specifically. Richard, you'd probably be the best person to ask this, but what's the percentage of people in the United States that are doing home hemodialysis today?
It's really super low. It's less than 4%.
Less than 4%.
Yeah.
What about peritoneal dialysis?
Peritoneal dialysis is a little more than that. I mean, so if you think about it, there's probably about 20% of patients at home. The difference of that is the peritoneal dialysis population.
Got it.
And it makes sense because, I mean,
More
peritoneal
widely
dialysis is something that makes sense for patients, especially when they're new to dialysis and they still have residual renal function. It's important for you to try to maintain that residual renal function. And all the studies point to PD, peritoneal dialysis, as being the best way to do that.
Right. Very gentle and
very gentle, very
continuous.
continuous, very less peaks and valleys,
Yeah.
all of that. And I know you've kind of touched on some of that in your other podcasts that the other shows that you've done.
Yep.
And I think that's something to be, kind of important is to remember is that PD is still probably the easiest way to do home dialysis.
Yeah.
But eventually it stops working.
Yeah.
And I think what happens in a lot of cases is, if you're not familiar or comfortable, even as clinicians, with the home hemodialysis aspect of this, you end up losing a lot of patients to in-center dialysis who potentially would have been great candidates to be at home. Yeah. And so I think that's kind of one of the important things that I learned through my journey with doing this was that even though my dad bypassed, the good thing is I got pulled into that home program.
Yeah.
And because I had a passion for patients the way I did after seeing the situation with my dad, it helped because I'll tell you, like almost immediately, in my head, when I saw my dad be successful at home hemodialysis, other people's faces were popping in my head. This person could do it. That person could do it. And this person could do it. Yeah. And so eventually, everybody, like I said, my dad was a popular guy wherever he went. So he was kind of like center of attention. I always on stage, always the center of attention kind of guy. So everybody in the dialysis clinic knew who my dad was, right? So when I go out on the floor and I'm working with my patients in my pod during the mornings and afternoons when I'm helping out, hey, how's your dad doing? Oh, he's doing really good. He's back to work. He's coaching again. He's playing in his band. He's doing all these things. You guys should go see him. He's playing at this place. He's playing at that place. Go check him out. And, they would come back to me and they'd be like, how can I do what your dad is doing? And I'm like, it's really easy. If you're interested, let's go over. When you get off, let's go over. We'll talk to the nurses. I'll show you all the stuff. And we'll go over what it takes to do this at home on your own.
So you guys started converting.
And my mom, my mom was our biggest advocate. Like on clinic days, my mom would show up early and she would sit in our lobby in the dialysis clinic because they were kind of like all in one. And she would talk to people as they came in and she would tell them about my dad and how he's able to do all these things. And usually she had my kids with her too. So she's like, we're watching the kids. We're doing all this. We're doing that.
Yeah.
So she always had a good story. Within 3 years time of opening that program, like we had like 65 plus home hemo patients, just home hemo patients. Wow. Our in-center unit only had 18 chairs. So if you can compare, like we were almost the same size. Our home program was almost the same size as our in-center program.
That's awesome, though. I mean, that's kind of ahead of the time, right? And kind of where we're seeing a lot of organizations and dialysis kind of plant their flags is in expanding on their care network through like transitional care or home training programs that are attached to their chronic units or hopefully not right on site, right? Because you mentioned the kind of viewing convenience and then losing some patients to in-center dialysis because they just see it as a much easier option in some cases, right?
Well, and I think it was important to be able to create that environment where you had everything in one place. Yes. I think the piece that really stood out for me was, I wanted patients to compare the two different, because they would see like somebody went to the home program and they're like, oh, and usually when you stop seeing patients show up in center, that meant that something bad happened. Right. And so we would go down that road and like, oh, what happened to so-and-so? I don't see them anymore. Oh no, you know what? They went home.
They're seeing it on stage.
Yeah. they went home and they're back to normal life and they're doing this, they're doing that. And we see them only once a month now.
Yeah.
And that was like, wait a minute, all of a sudden it's like, I want to do that too. Is that something I can do? Yeah. And so then it would open up the conversation.
I definitely want to circle back to that kind of that root of your purpose. Before that, Luz, you mentioned something that's kind of gave me goosebumps. What can mom do? I think you said something along those lines. Sit there and observe from home. And I thought about my mom and me as a father, how that would feel. Can you speak to that at all? Did she share with you what that was like for 7 years of you going to a facility?
I really think what she showed herself like very strong. I never thought that she had emotions or feelings, but in reality, there was a lot of fear because it's something unknown. Like again, what we always heard, and we were not well, like we didn't know well enough what dialysis was.
Yeah.
So our expectation was you're gonna die.
Right.
So I'm an only child. So and we've been alone it's been only, I always say me and her against the world for over 20 years. And I guess it was a lot of fear from both of us. Her because seeing her only child die right in front of her eyes.
Yep.
And me as an only child thinking what's gonna happen to my mother if I go.
Right.
So it's a lot.
Yep.
It's a lot emotionally.
Thank you. Again, that gave me goosebumps when I heard that, because I think, any one of us could imagine the person that you just described that we love the most in this world, and without them, what do I do, right? And then on the other side, if I'm gone, what's
going to happen?
What will they do? That's a scary thought.
But I think one of the commitments and missions that we have in as technicians, home care program and center is to give some of that power back to our patients, because sometimes they think, oh, there's nothing I can do, but yes, there's a lot that you can do as a patient and as a family member.
Agreed.
Yeah.
So let's dive into today. You guys, by all means, I think you've already worked yourself up as experts, but let's start with Luz. What are you doing today? And I think there's a few different hats, but what are you doing today? How are you serving patients in this space?
Well, nowadays I do in center. I cover 3 days, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And I do clinic. And on the side, I have my own business, as you mentioned at the beginning, for home hemodialysis. So I serve people in their home settings where they don't have to worry about anything but just being present and ready to go in dialysis. So that's my job right now, and
so can
my
you tell
purpose.
me? Can you tell me a little bit? I'm really interested in that. You have an individual that is a home dialysis patient already. Somehow they meet you. There's a lot of, I guess, muddiness around having somebody provide care for you at home, right? So who are these individuals? And I'm not talking their names, but how is it that they actually come to a place where they're getting a professional, an expert like you coming into their home and basically like white glove? Is that what I'm hearing? Like you do it all for them, right?
Yes. So what happens is that in reality, it's not well known that there is companies. I'm not the only one. There is several companies out there that serve people at home. They don't know. And a lot of people, they do have the financial situation where they can pay for home hemo.
So this is a private?
Yes, it is a private.
And that's when we say concierge, typically that's what concierge is, right? Like you're talking about more affluent people in typical scenario.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, for the moment, hopefully, eventually we can get something.
Yeah. No, and I know that you and I have talked about this on multiple occasions, and it recently, earlier last year in 23, I was actually on a panel discussion, and in one of our big conferences that are attended by physicians and nephrologists from across the country, and I was invited to be part of a panel discussion, and one of the questions that came up was, what do you see coming that could change the future of inception or adoption of home dialysis, especially home hemodialysis in the industry? And I think my answer was exactly that. It was, we have to find a way to pay for staff assist. I think when you pay for staff assist, it eliminates so many of the negative trends that are kind of associated with having to do dialysis at home and being that care partner. Yeah. Because, it's not easy for people to learn how to put needles in. It's not easy to have the responsibility of, care for, it's not easy to do it in an in-center setting, let alone at home when you're by yourself with no support. Now, granted, you know, there's a lot of benefits that come with doing more frequent dialysis over a period of, you know, 5 days.
Right.
But there's still always that underlying risk.
Right.
Because we're dealing with patients who are the disease process itself is called end stage renal disease.
Yeah.
So having that kind of there, it puts that in the back of your mind all the time. It's like something could go wrong and I could end up losing my loved one
And I
right
think
here.
It's fear. It's
Total.
fear. Like if we're afraid to start dialysis in center, how much more fear can we get as doing on your own?
Oh yeah.
At least
Yeah.
you have in center, you have somebody to call on, and trust that they're going to be able to do and react accordingly.
Agreed. I mean, I've been teaching professionals for 25
And something that I wanted
years. So these, I just want to get this out there, is that when I ask people, you know, what would you want to do if you had kidney failure? Most people, like, no way I could do that at home.
At home,
you know, yeah, even they don't have kidney failure yet, right?
Yeah.
They have all the ability to learn today, and these sort of, it's not critical for them. They still like, no way I would want to go to a center on most scenarios. Sorry, Luz, go ahead.
I don't know, something that I wanted to mention when I was in school, it was you saying between homemade food and restaurant, what would you prefer? And of course, it's always going to be home. And that has always stick with me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like home, it's always going to be better.
Yeah. Yep.
And that's a good point. And I think Michael, you touch on a good point, and you talk about people taking the time to understand the differences and getting educated on it, right? And a lot of people don't understand that, you know, 5-year survival on in-center dialysis. I've done this in your classes and talked to
Yes.
40% 5-year survival
Right.
on in-center dialysis.
Yeah.
And then move that to PD, peritoneal dialysis. It doesn't go up very much. It's only 50%.
Right.
5-year survival.
Yep.
You know, we can extend that a little bit with 5-day-a-week dialysis, and it goes up to like 58% with the 5-day-a-week dialysis. And even better when you talk nocturnal at home more frequently, right? You get up to the point where your 5-year survival is the same as if you were to get a cadaveric transplant. But how many of our patients are familiar with those stats?
No, yeah, no.
Right? I mean, and I think that's the big barrier for a lot of people. It's, I think, when you really talk about, you know, what would you do if you had to make that choice? It's not just, well, what would you do on the spot of the moment? It's like, let me give you all of the information and then tell me what you would do.
Right.
Because if I were to tell you out of the gate, I don't want to do this myself. I don't know anything. Of course, I want somebody else to do it who's an expert to do it.
Limited information gives, you know, a limited response.
Right. And I think that talks to a little bit about how we educate our patients today.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, and even though there's initiatives and you know, motivators and drivers out there trying to push the industry, the dialysis industry, to do a better job of educating, I really feel like we're just scratching the surface. I think there's so much more that we can do. There's a lot of programs out there that have best practices that have not been adopted by the entire industry.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that we as responsible experts and people that experience this personally need to advocate more for it and really put it out there that, you know, if you're not doing all of this type of education and you're seeing like Luz falling into dialysis the way she did and the way my dad did, then there's room for improvement. And the sad thing is I still see it happening today.
Yeah.
And this was back in 2006.
Right.
It's still happening.
Yeah,
you know?
we haven't made a whole lot of progress on that front, right?
Right.
Richard, let's catch up today. You know, as an SME, what are you doing? How are you helping the same community that we're focused on today?
Yeah, so I'm still sharing my dad's story. And what people are starting to see now, that there was so much more to the story that, you know, my dad's story has become mine. Yeah. And you know, my dad's no longer with us. My dad passed away a couple of years after being on home hemo and having to go back to in-center dialysis. And so today my role, I mean, I've had a lot of different roles. I've worked in home programs. I came to work for a products company that does nothing but home devices. And today my responsibility is to work even further upstream. Today my goal is to work further upstream with health systems, IDNs, hospitals, to make sure that they have the type of equipment that is available in the home setting,
right,
so that patients can get exposed to it further upstream, and it's not so intimidating. It's not so scary. They can have a broader base of information when they come into that point where they have to make a decision as to, do I want to go to an in-center program or do I want to be a home patient?
Yeah.
And I mean, the drive is really kind of getting there to where the government is even pushing now for patients to go home, which has never really been a thing until the last few years.
Yep.
And so it's important for us to really kind of understand, you can't just put an initiative out there and then don't put a structure out there to get it done.
Yeah.
And so my goal is to connect the dots. And I cover 27 states now.
Wow.
So I have a real broad area that I can impact.
Yeah.
And my goal is to work with health systems and hospitals to help introduce this so that they can keep having that education conversation at an earlier point in the process versus waiting till they have no option.
Yeah, that's so important. I mean, there's a certain benefit of callus, right? You get exposed to something that's not so pleasant, actually, like ESKD or ESRD early on, and that, hey, if you have this, like you said, Luz, it's not the end of the world. It's now the opportunity to either one, sustain life, or two, rehabilitate and live life first with dialysis as a tool to doing so. Right?
Yeah. No, and I think the other thing that's important is to really focus in on education, not just with patients, but with family.
Yeah.
And I think because like we talk about the whole cultural aspect of this, right? Let's be real. I mean, the people that are impacted by this the most look like you and me.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think it's important for us as being part of that culture to be out there talking to people like us because they hear it better from us than they do from other people. And I think that's another thing that we kind of have that responsibility. And I know you, me, and Mike, we've been doing this for a long time. And I'm sure you have too.
Well, it's a whole different perspective than you guys because you see the other side in a lot more larger situation than I have.
Yeah.
But it's very nice to hear from two experts that are really into making this very adaptable for patients.
Yeah.
To not be afraid, because it's, again, fear is something that stops us a lot of the times to make better decisions for ourselves. And
I would say just to kind of, because don't ever discount yourself as an expert, because I'll tell you right now, in all the years I've been doing this, the most credible people
100.
are you, or people that like you. And I've made it a part of what I do when I go out and do these educations is to include patient advocates. And those patient advocates are people who have the same experiences like you do, because it's way more real coming from someone like you.
No, and amen. Yes. One of the things that I've learned working as a technician, and previous to that, you were saying being advocate. One of the things that they told me when getting evaluated for transplant, you had to be your first best advocate.
Oh yeah,
That's
of course.
one. Two.
No one else will.
I had to go to this for up in California. There was a law going on, and I went with a corporation. And anyways, the thing was, people want to hear your stories. People want to know about patients because patients do not have an idea of how much power they have when it comes to their care. It could be in home care or in facilities. They do not have an idea how much power they have. And I think it's great, again, to hear from people that have been doing this for so long. How much is your willingness to give that power to the patients?
Right.
Let's shift gears a little bit, because Richard, you really segued into kind of a section that I within every podcast, I'd like to hit a few buzz topics, kind of what's a hot conversation, or maybe it's not.
Needs to be.
but you said something along the lines of that a lot of the patients out there would look like us, right? And we know that the highest incidence prevalence would be among African American, Hispanic, Latinos, right, in the United States. So we've touched on type 2 diabetes in this conversation as well, right? We're in the city of Bellflower that's got a pretty high-risk demographic as well, as far as the environment and all of the factors that could lead to chronic illness. So let's talk about that a little bit. Hispanics and African Americans. What's your experience? What's your initiative in the evangelism to this particular population? And then I'll throw just a caveat out there that we know that the highest incidence of type 2 diabetes, hypertension, chronic kidney disease is in those two ethnicities, right? But then we also know that the lowest utilization of therapy like home dialysis, home hemodialysis, is the same specific group of ethnicity.
Yeah. And I think, it's becoming more and more real for me. I mean, and I'll disclose this as, I'm pushing 50. I'll turn 50 this year. And I check all of those boxes, hypertension, type 2 diabetes. Those are things that I have to deal with now,
Right.
that I'm, as I get older and partially due to bad, habits, but also genetics, right? My dad was a diabetic. My grandfather was a diabetic. My uncles are diabetic. So all of that kind of tying into it, it's important for me to really kind of start this conversation at home.
Yeah.
In my everyday life, it's not just in dialysis that people see me as kind of like the dialysis expert.
Yeah.
It's in my friends and family too. And those conversations happen around the dinner table. They happen, when we're out with friends. They happen when we're, in any social kind of setting. It happens. I try not to be the guy that just comes with dialysis conversation all the time.
But you do.
But it's important because it's who I am. It's part of who I am, and it's part of my life experience. And I'll tell you, just last week, I buried a friend who was a dialysis patient. And, and the biggest thing, a Latino, somebody everybody looked up to, but didn't want to be a burden to his family and refused to do home dialysis. And regardless of how many conversations I had, I appreciate you. I love that you're giving me the information. I just don't want to be a burden to my family. And so when you go down that road, you kind of hear you learn that this is something that we have to change as a culture. And in order to change it as a culture, I think it has to start at home. And it has to start with not being afraid to ask for help, or not being afraid to have that conversation with your friends and your loved ones to really understand, is it really a burden?
Yeah.
Because you may be assuming something that isn't real. And I think a lot of times that's what happens with, I've heard it so many times when I would educate patients in the home setting and hear them say, oh, well, I can't do this because of this. And I don't want to put this on my wife, and I don't want to put this on my wife. And then I get the wife in a room by herself and we have the same conversation. She's like, I can't wait to do this. It's going to be so much less stress to have to worry about, where he is and how he's doing when he's at the center. And I have him in my home. I can see him. I know what he's doing. I know what and they don't have that conversation. So I think that's the kind of setting that we need to establish. And it's hard to do from, the clinic side. We have to do it at home so that other people can see the example of what that should look like.
Yeah.
And so that we can really kind of discuss that stuff going forward. Because even now, I'm admit, we're not the most emotionally connected family because I have 2 boys, and we're not huggers. We don't do all that kind of stuff, but we still don't have a problem having real conversations about these type of scenarios.
Yep.
Well, I think it's keep educating your patients, their families, get involved in the community. Because yes, we a lot of the times think we think that there is no choice. This is it, but no, there's a lot more to it. And again, give the power to the patients. They have so much power. I constantly educate my patients. I'm the grouchy girl that is like, okay, what's going on? I remember you telling that. Ask questions. Ask questions as a provider, tech, nurse, staff. Ask questions. Get involved in your patients, and then if you see somebody that it's a good candidate for a home or to go home, provide the info. Educate, because that gives the power to the person that can make the most impact on their treatments. This is something that I always talk to patients is out of the 100% of your dialysis treatment, our responsibility is at 10%.
Yeah.
The other 90, it's you.
Yeah.
Because the one that decides to come to treatment, it's you. The one that decides your diet, it's you.
Yep.
Your meds,
Yep.
complete your treatments, it's you.
Yeah.
So I'll make them aware how much power they have.
Oh yeah, you're what? And I always mess this number up, but you got, is it 160 hours, 168 hours in the week,
In the
right?
week.
But you come for 12, and you have 156. That you've got to do the things that are
Right.
best for you. You know,
It's character, right? It's like, what do you do when no one's looking?
Yeah,
You know?
exactly. So hey guys, you know, I think, you know, we're all aligned. I am a strong believer in home dialysis, home hemodialysis, home peritoneal dialysis, home care as a whole. You know, kind of having autonomy and dignity in being able to live first and dialyze around all of that, right? There are quite a few issues in the workforce today that I'm not sure how they're affecting home dialysis numbers just as of yet, but you know, I don't think we're in great shape pre-COVID, but after COVID, from a staffing perspective, like we've got these staffing shortages now that are just crazy in just about every area of the workforce, healthcare, you know, a stronghold because it's critical in the case of dialysis staff, right? We've got educator shortages. I own a business that's a school. You guys know this. You've helped with us and even attended our classes. But pre-COVID in California, there was about 4 times more schools than there are today. So educator shortages. Nursing, same thing. Within the university, same thing, right? Wage index has changed drastically. I mean, we keep track of these things in the business that I own of the graduate starting salary rates. They've gone up tremendously, which puts a little bit of a stress on the healthcare system as a whole. But hey, cost of living, people have to live, right?
Right.
Work ethic has really
Kind of dropped off, huh?
I don't know, man. Like you guys tell me. And then, you know, what overall, you know, shortages, wage index, work ethic. What's the result on and the impact on care today, Richard?
Yeah, you know, I see it all the time. I mean, that's one of the biggest barriers I have. I work a lot with skilled nursing facilities and trying to put programs in place in those locations to prevent patients from having to transport, right?
Yep.
And that it always goes back to that. Like, well, we don't have the nursing staff or the staff in general to put them in those facilities. So that is definitely a problem. That being said, I think we make it really hard for nurses to be created. And I just, again, I speak from personal experience. My son, who you know, who attended classes here with you online, but is now in Chicago going to nursing school to get his master's in nursing.
Yeah.
Because he couldn't find a program that would let him in here in California.
Oh, wow.
So
I didn't
he
even realize that's why he.
That's why
I thought he just wanted to get away from.
Well, yeah, right. You would think that would be the reason.
Like you
but
talk about dialysis all the time, Dad. Like,
yeah,
I'm ready to
right.
go.
And that's the thing, you know, like that's what drove him to being a nurse, and he's still not even sure if that's where he's going to land. He may want to go into become a nurse practitioner or something else, but you know, at 23 years old, he's got plenty of time to decide what he wants to do with that. But the fact that it's not an isolated thing, like he had to travel halfway across the country in order to get access to a program that he could achieve what he's trying to achieve.
Yeah.
This is not something that we hear, few and far between. This is something we hear all the time.
Right.
You know, here in California, our nursing programs are so impacted.
Yep.
There's a waiting list in every one of them, and we can cry about the shortage of nurses, but unless we're doing something different to accelerate that process, and I'm not saying cut corners,
right.
I'm just saying expand. But again, you get the pushback. Well, we don't have enough educators, and we don't. So how do we change that? I don't know. I don't have all the answers to that. But I think it starts with a cultural change. Yeah. And I think what we really need to realize is we need to value those, not just the nurses that are working in the facilities. We also need to value the nurses that are in the field. Yes. We need to really engage the use of licensed vocational nurses. Yeah. I think that there's a limit that, you know, I'm personally an LVN.
Right.
And I feel like, you know, I had to go to school too. Yet there are certain things I can't do to help a nurse on the floor.
Right.
Because the state regulations that are out there. Yep. I think when you're in a time of crisis, you need to adapt. And if we're not adapting, then we're setting ourselves up for failure.
Nursing scope of practice has been very guarded over the years for good reason. I mean, it's patient safety and the effectiveness of delivery of care, right? But I think you hit on something really important there, is that, you know, are we in a crisis as far as these shortages? And you spoke of nurses, but what about technicians? How are we looking in that regard?
I really think so, but it's a lot has to do with, like you were saying, regulations, either state or companies. Sometimes there is, I really love certain companies for training. Like their training, it's amazing. But when it comes to the workload, they're putting a lot of workload.
Got it.
So that really impacts.
At least I'm glad they're putting a lot of training if it's the higher workload.
Yeah, but it's like, at the end of the people, you're losing great technicians.
Because they're stressed.
Because they're stressed. And it's like, at the end of the day, yes, you really care for patients. Yes, you're really passionate about your job. But how much are you willing to put there for somebody that is not giving back?
Yeah.
You know, and this, I mean, the companies, like in general.
Well, and to add to that, you know, you think about it. I know I have family that are technicians, right? That work in the industry, and they all work 2 jobs.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yep.
And I think that when you put people in a position to where they have to work 2 jobs to be able to make ends meet, you're asking for trouble, and that's a big piece of it.
And something that I've seen, and when I first started working as a technician, is seeing so many great technicians out on the floor. Yet they've been in companies for 20 years, and they're making very little, like very little. It's like, how? Like you have so much experience. You're basically running the whole clinic, yet you're making this.
Right.
I think we need to evaluate what's important, because at the end of the day, we're dealing with lives. You know, something that I've been listening a lot in this past year, probably a lot more than before, is like, how come people, and I'm not denigrating like people that are working restaurants, right? But how come they're paying about the same or sometimes even more than us, that we deal with lives? We're saving lives. We were called in the pandemic heroes because we were saving lives. Yet, how much are you giving us for that? Because we're saving lives, giving a big part of our lives.
Well, let's keep that one pretty simple, I think. You know, because it's a loaded conversation.
It is.
Actually. But for anybody who's gonna, in our networks, that is gonna listen to this podcast or that is watching it regularly, like, health policy, right? Healthcare policy is critical. Like, we actually vote on stuff, right? And there's only so much money that these clinics can charge or these organizations can charge for the care, right? Today, in most cases, an average treatment is in the red, meaning they're losing money on the treatment, right?
Yep.
So, you know, number one is healthcare policy. And I think that, you know, everybody who hears this can take a closer look at healthcare policy and how it's impacting the care of people with chronic illness, or how it's restricting care of people with chronic illness. Richard, can you speak to this? You've been around for quite a while as far as, you know, the offerings of home dialysis, the offering of dialysis, more treatments, things like this. How does reimbursement really kind of drive this whole issue that we're talking about?
Well, I'll tell you, I mean, from my experience, it's been that, like, home hemodialysis is probably one of the most profitable offerings out there, right? Mostly because you bill for every treatment, and if you're doing 5 days a week with medical justification, you can get paid for that.
There's more billable.
There's more billable services out there being provided if you're doing that, and with good reason. You know, those patients on home hemo get better clinical outcomes, which means less money on medications, less time in the hospital, less complications. There's a lot of, you know, economic connections. So total cost of care. And I think that's something that gets overlooked when you look at hospitals and how they kind of operate. You know, when you're thinking about a patient and you're getting ready to discharge them from the hospital, the biggest thing you're trying to manage is length of stay. and rehospitalization, readmission rates.
Yeah.
And so
that's where the big dollars come from.
So
Medicare
if you take a
reimbursement.
patient that's on dialysis and you put that patient back in a 3-day-a-week setting, it's really a high likelihood that that patient within the first 30 to 60 days is probably going to end up back in the hospital again for some other related issue. And then that means that hospital doesn't get paid in that first 30 days. If they come back, they don't get paid for that patient anymore. So now all of those services are being given away for free, which then makes it harder to manage at a hospital level. So I think, this goes back to education. If we were able to expose more patients into home modalities and get them to go home, not only would they save us the cost of having to build brick and mortar for the community in-center dialysis programs, it would also give them better clinical outcomes that would help overall prevent them from going back into those vacuums where you're sucking money from both insurance payers or from Medicare to take care of that patient. And so I think this is why I always say, like, if you're going to change a culture, you have to make big changes. Like, I think I've heard it on your other show is the do nothing effect. When you do nothing, nothing changes, right?
That's right.
And so when we can do a lot of little cosmetic things around the surface that are all good practices. But until we go back and change the structure of things, and it has to start with the first person who comes in contact with that patient and really kind of making sure, look, I'm not just going to hit the easy button and send you to a 3-day-a-week. We shouldn't be talking about, your only options here are Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. We should be talking about, look, you're really a good candidate to go home. So instead of putting yourself into that center, let's talk about putting you in a home modality. What is it like? Let's really make that recommendation, not just say, oh, it's a patient's choice. Because then if you say it, because then it becomes, how do you present that choice? Right.
The onus is not on them to find that choice. The actual intersubjective, interdisciplinary exposure is how they're going to be enlightened, right? By people they trust. Sometimes it takes people that look like them.
Right. And by the way, those people get paid to provide that education.
Right. That's right.
And so there should be metrics as to how that education is delivered. And I think that's where it makes it difficult, right? Because who's assessing that education? Is it a box you check on a form, or is it somebody actually qualified and trained to provide education to people in crisis? Because that's what we're dealing with. When people are learning about something like this, is they're in a crisis scenario, and it may not be something that can be easily done really quickly as you go from one patient to the next. It may be something that you have to do differently. And I know that there's a lot of good CKD programs out there that talk about education, but again, there's not enough of them.
Agreed. And I think reimbursement is another avenue there, right? So I want to touch on one of those key topics, the work ethic, because in my career, like, a big part of it has been trying to transfer work ethic, and I don't want to necessarily transfer my work ethic to everybody, because maybe I work a little too many hours. You do.
Work-life balance is not always there.
I can't speak to that side so much, but I am seeing a change in the work ethic and kind of the connection between the dollar and what I do. And I gotta say, it really disturbs me, because I never have really been any different for $12 or $250 an hour. I'm going to put 185%, or just all of it in there, because I'm about outcome, right? And I used to see a lot of dialysis techs that were similar. Like, they didn't have to be making the highest dollar to provide the highest level of care, but I do see a bit of a shift in some of the newer workforce that I'm not going to train somebody new in the clinic because I'm not getting paid extra. I'm not going to, be the closer when there's no closer because I'm not getting paid extra, things like this. So have you guys noticed a shift in what you're seeing in the dialysis clinics? Richard, you see a lot of the work ethic in the skilled nursing facilities. Luz, anything?
I really think that it comes to as a community. Sometimes we think that because this is happening to my neighbor, it's not going to happen to me. So, like, that's his job. That's not my job. So we don't to start a change, I think we have to be the first ones to step up and start the change. You know, sometimes we like to pinpoint people, like, you're not doing this, you're not doing that. And instead of being part of the solution, we're part of the problem.
Agreed.
So I think, yes, in the healthcare, or in this case, dialysis, as a community, we need to start thinking about, what can I do to make a difference? You know, for my neighbor, for my loved one, what's my part in this story?
Yeah.
Am I going to be only a spectator, or am I going to be actually a player? So that comes to the work ethic. You know, like, I see a lot of kids coming in, they're just there for 1 week, 2 weeks, and then they're gone. Or sometimes nurses that don't really like to listen to people that have been there longest. They're not willing to learn. We're not willing to learn. We're not willing to adapt, like he said earlier. You know, there is a lot of room of opportunity to improve. What we're doing is just, it's a whole thing. It's a community. It takes a team to make it happen. And
I've always said that, even to the students that I've taught over the years, that you may find yourself working in a place with a lot of poor work ethic, and I agree with you 100%. Luz. Like the whole clinic, or the majority of the clinic, has got that paycheck tech. You know, I clock in this time, I clock out that time, type of mentality, and maybe it's even worse than that. Maybe it's, you know, if nobody saw me do it, then it didn't happen, right? The tree in the forest type of thing. But if I set the example, that then, you know, there's like this sense of onus on me to do the right thing when Luz is doing the right thing, right?
I think there's a synonymous way to discuss that, and I think, you know, leadership and exampleship are very synonymous, right? They kind of align with each other. And I think in a lot of the environments, not even just in dialysis, but in general in our communities and in everything that we do, there's a lot of leadership vacuum.
Yeah.
Right. We don't have the amount of leadership, exampleship that we need in the community to kind of shift some of this as a culture. Right.
Yeah.
So like one of the things that I do is I volunteer. I volunteer a lot. I mean, probably more than I should, because I spend more time doing that because I've always done it. And it's kind of the example my parents set growing up. And even though I swore I would never become my parents growing up in the baseball field or in a football field.
It happens later, right?
It doesn't. You can hate it all your life growing up, but when you get to that point in your life, you end up doing exactly like what you saw. Yeah. And I think for me, to this day, I still volunteer with a youth leadership program where I go take a week of my time and I go up the mountain with these middle school kids and I spend as a camp nurse, but it's not just about being a camp nurse because I'm also a board member in this group. And what I do is I set the example, and I think it's important to kind of show like these kids, like, you know, we all come up here for free. Like we don't get paid to be here.
Right.
We volunteer our time to show you how to become leaders in your communities. And whatever it is you're going to do, you're going to set that tone. So that's where it has to start, because if our young people are learning work ethic, and don't get me wrong, there is a point of going overboard. And I think that happens a lot of times because, like I said, I watched my parents do it and I swore I would not become that person. In some cases, some kids make good on that. So if their parents worked super hard, they may say, I'm not going to be my parents. They worked way too hard. I'm not going to work that hard.
Right.
You have to have that balance.
My kids have said work smarter, not
harder.
Not harder.
Right.
I said, but do both, please.
Do both.
Do both. Do both.
A lot of rewarding comes when you do both.
Yeah.
And it's take ownership of your individual power.
Yeah.
Because sometimes we think well, if I do this right, it's not going to make a difference.
Right.
Yet your patients are watching.
Yep.
They have 4 3 hours.
Yep.
And they do see the difference.
Well, so do the people you work with. I mean, you know, I take a lot of accountability to what you're talking about, leadership and example. What'd you call it?
Exampleship. Yeah.
Exampleship. Yeah. In that, you know, or you called it integrity.
Integrity or character.
As well, right? It's like, I'm a father of 4. Definitely, I didn't realized that whole connectivity my whole life. You know what I mean? I got kids that are 26 and I got one that's 9. And I think the one that's 9, definitely I'd love for him to follow what he's seen. The ones that are 26, I wish they didn't remember those, you know,
do
the
as I
younger
say,
days.
not as I do.
Yeah. And, you know, I agree with you guys that, you know, in the clinic, you can change culture through that example. I would hope that people find it younger than I did. I'm not sure about you guys when you found it, but I definitely, you know, I had the mentality, not so much as a dialysis tech, but as a young man, that I had to learn a lot.
Well, and I think that's for me. Like I spent a lot of time with my grandparents growing up. My grandfather was he was the first one in his community to go to college and graduate with a bachelor's degree. I mean, and he tells stories about having to go to school, sharing a pair of shoes with one of his 13 brothers and sisters, you know? And so, you know, he went to World War II.
Oh, wow.
He came back, went to school on a GI Bill. So growing up in that environment, it was expected that we were going to work hard. It was expected that we were going to do these things. And I think that that's kind of what happens. You know, you kind of play into that scenario that you're set up for. And if you're not set up for it, you know, it's going to be up to you. And I think that was one of the things that I realized even in dialysis early on. I remember being told by one of my clinic managers, I remember there was a disagreement on the floor or something that I got frustrated with the situation. And I remember her pulling me off the floor and having a discussion with me and saying, you can't hold people to your level of expectation because your level of expectation exceeds everybody else. And what you expect of yourself is higher than what you expect. And I always had an issue with that statement because my question was, why shouldn't they accelerate or extend themselves to the level that I am performing at? It shouldn't be that my level is exceptional and theirs is the norm. It should be the other way around. Mine should be the norm, and they need to come up to here where I'm at.
Luz, I don't know if we had this conversation when we first met, but I ask a lot of aspiring technicians, nurses, I say, okay, if you needed somebody to help you in a healthcare procedure, a doctor, a nurse, whatever it is, would you want the person that was in the box? Did I say that to you?
Yes.
Do you want the in the box or do you want the above the box or below the box? And almost everybody's going to say they want above the box, right? So, you know, to kind of sum up that question with the work ethic is, I think something that I would hope that we can duplicate in our immediate circles, and then hopefully, you know, just start to evangelize a little bit more on, is that we would go the extra mile.
Yes.
You know, like this is what's expected, but I'm going to do more than what is expected.
I've been listening to all this coaching and self-development things, and they said there's no traffic on that extra mile.
That's awesome.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. I like that.
Because you're competing with a lot underneath, but after that extra mile, there is no traffic. Like
I really love that, because I got to tell you, I was like, we really appreciate your guys' time. I want to kind of get towards the last couple questions here, and one of them is kind of like, what's that last inspiring word? And I don't know if you can top that. If I
nailed it. I don't even want to say anything.
Yeah, that was pretty awesome. The last mile, or the extra mile.
There's no traffic on that extra mile. That's a T-shirt for sure.
So do we have a citation for this, or where do we find this? Because it's pretty powerful.
Well, I've been following this guy. I don't know if I can say his name, but it's a life coach.
Well, let's drop it in the comments. And I think, you know, again, that was a great.
But overall, without saying names, I think the best and biggest investment that you can do is on yourself. Keep learning, keep trying, and strive for better. The best version of yourself is what's going to get you to your dreams. And that's something I mentioned in a comment about the school, is that give yourself the chance to be better and to bring those dreams come true. Because maybe dialysis is not your thing, but in dialysis you can meet a lot of people that will definitely show you the road to what you really want to do in life.
So since you stole my thunder on the,
I'm sorry.
You know, let's leave a last closing remark with, you know, you kind of touched on something we're really focused on right now, which is like dream big and like give yourself that chance, right? Really focus on educating people that want to fall into healthcare professions. And it doesn't really matter whether it's a dialysis tech or nurse. We also want to coach people that are, LVNs in nursing homes and CNAs and MAs, meeting them in the nephrology clinics, things like this, right? So, Luz, I've known you now for 8 years.
8 years, yes.
8 years, and from day one to to where we're at now is such a crazy difference.
Thank you.
We've done some work together recently that you've really helped me out on a few things. But what's going to be the impact of Luz Lopez on this population?
On this population, I really think that something that I said earlier, it's purpose, and that's not only for dialysis patients, but people in general. Are we leaving, or are we just surviving? It's like, it can be for somebody that has no health issues at all.
Mm-hmm.
Are you really leaving, or are you just surviving? What's your legacy? What's your legacy that you're leaving behind? And it's even now, what's the impact that you're going to make in this world? I've always had this idea of what's a grain of sand on the beach? Nothing. What's a grain of sand in your eye? What can make that? So be that grain of sand. And that's I think how I can summarize all of this. It's been a pleasure to be here and hear so many like good stories and people that are really leading by example, like you two guys and Paco back there. So
Thanks
it's
for
a
joining
pleasure.
us.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think for me, about leaving a legacy is I'm gonna kind of quote these 3 words that we use in the nonprofit that I work with, and it's the 3 words are familia, leadership, and pride. And I think it goes back to that for everyone, no matter what your race, ethnicity, culture, whatever it is. You take care of your family and the people that are close to you, like your family. Have pride in what you do, and be that leader. Because even when you're at the bottom of the rung of the ladder, you're still going to be somebody that's going to be you're going to be that one that somebody has to stand on your shoulders to get to the next level.
Yeah.
And that's a form of leadership in and of itself. And I think that's something I've always heard from one of our guest speakers that we use at this conference, and he always used that analogy is like, I'm going to be those shoulders that you can stand on to get even further than where I am now. And so that's the goal. And so my goal is, my legacy is, I want to be able to set a foundation for someone else to get to that next level. And that's kind of the leadership role I want to lead. I have pride in what I do, and I mean, that more than anybody.
Yep.
I always want to be the best at everything that I do.
Yep.
And that's just part of who I am. And I always want to be able to take care of my family and friends and really kind of be that example for them.
That's awesome. So I guess I should take some of my own medicine. This is episode number 5 of the Musings with Morales podcast. And we've met with people that are dialysis technicians, a couple now, registered dietitians, all the way upstream, people who help people stay healthy and keep fitness. And then even the more intensive side of things just last Wednesday with interventional radiologists, vascular access surgeons. And, my 2 cents to my contribution is that I keep abstract. I think you guys both know that. I don't even know what I want to do when I grow up yet.
Same.
I want to be like you when I grow up.
I think I have a lot of strong characteristics in adding to community, but I really don't know where I'll end up and what that final mark would be. But the one thing that I'm so proud of is that, as a business owner, as an educator, as an evangelist or an advocate, I always look for the best. You know what I mean? That's what I'm looking for, is people that are the best to teach me. So I'm so thankful to you guys for joining us today, sharing your wisdom, your experiences, your purpose, your passion, and hopefully the watchers of this episode will really benefit, prevent what's preventable, talk about what needs to be talked about at home, and understand how important those connections of the people that you love and the people that love you really, really are. I think, we've learned a valuable lesson about love today in, what you provided with Dad, what Mom provided with you. And I have very similar experience with a loved one as well. It's the whole reason why I started this. So thank you both for joining us today, and have a great weekend.
Right, thank you.
Thank you for having us.
This episode has been brought to you by Dialysis Education Services.